raised in Brantford, Ontario, to parents who came from India. Um, and my parents came from India in the 1970s, and they couldn't use their education and their skills that they had from India, so they actually worked in factories in Canada. But something that was really important to them was two things were really important to them was education and athletics. And I think that their thought was that, if their kids are educated, that will help them get out of poverty, to not have to work in factories, to have jobs, and they also valued the importance of athletics to, one, keep us busy and healthy, and avoid being bored and getting into trouble. But also they chose tennis as the sport for us, because they always thought that respected people play tennis. And so I started playing tennis, I think, when I was 6 years old, and I played quite competitively. I was highly ranked in Ontario and Canada. I used to play in tournaments all the time, and then I stopped in high school when I was injured and I hurt my knee. So that was sort of my childhood and what my parents valued. And my role model was my mom. So my mom came to Canada when she was very young. She married a man she didn't know, and then she worked really, really hard to raise us. And she's like one of the hardest workers I know, but she's also very kind. So she does everything for everybody else. Yeah, like, even now, like when I had a baby, she stopped working so that she could take care of my baby when I went to work, so that I could go to work. So even as an adult, she like sacrifices herself so that I can have a better life. It's important for people to hear, and young women to hear, that you don't have to come from a rich background. You don't have to come from like a very educated background, especially in Indian families. Like, lots of people are vulnerable, but you can still do something with your life and, get out of that, get out of the poverty and whatever, and make a difference. It wasn't that disappointing to me, actually, because it was like I had a career when I was a kid, and it wasn't, sometimes you just don't want to do that anymore. And I really liked school. Like, I liked being in school, and I like learning. And so it just gave me the opportunity to like shift to focusing more on my education, rather than trying to split both of them. So it wasn't terrible. And I actually learned like lots of important skills through tennis. Like, the ability to work hard, the ability to manage time. Like, I used to just do my homework in the car between lessons. And like, but I valued my education, that like I would play a tennis match and then study for a test before my next tennis match. And I thought that was very important, and it stayed with me because I've just been able to juggle a variety of things, and just manage my time to try to do as much as I can, even though I don't play tennis anymore. For me, success is found in my relationships with my family, with my friends, with my colleagues at work. And if I feel like I can be kind to people, or listen to people, or help someone, or I have a good relationship with them, they support me, that to me is successful. So for me, it's not about the papers or the grants. It's more about like the relationships I build. I think for my work life, I think my most successful things what I feel most proud of is when my students, you know, they learn something new, they get new skills, and then they go get a job in the field that they always wanted to be in. So to me, that feels like success, that I was able to support someone um to to be able to go somewhere with their career and help them achieve their career goals. So I guess that would be how I define success. Accidentally, I think. I'm from an Indian family, and Indian families typically want their children to be doctors, mostly doctors, lawyers, or engineers. Um, so I always had the feeling that I was supposed to be a doctor. And but then I went to university, and I took, a variety of courses, but the ones I really liked the most were the ecology courses. And I really liked, like, I cared about the environment. I liked working on the environment. I also really liked statistics, my statistics classes, and like identifying patterns in ecology. And then in my fourth year, I took a limnology course, and I thought, oh, this seems important. And I remember when I was starting my master's, I had a choice. I there are two projects I was debating between. One was looking at the behavior of snails, and then the other, because I really liked animal behavior studies and figuring out, like, understanding why animals behaved the way that they did. Or I could have done a master's in conjunction with the Ministry of Environment in Ontario, looking at water quality in Lake Erie and how it changed after the zebra mussel invasion. And we'd had some cases in Ontario where poor water quality had negatively affected communities. And, going back to India and visiting where my parents came from, just seeing like the state of the water that was, and waste management and all of that, that was a big problem to people. And I just thought this is an important field, and I want to do something that's helpful and useful, and it seemed important. And it's kind of accidentally how I ended up there, but I'm really glad that I did, because now, I think of water, it's the base of life, and without clean water, um, you can't live. So I feel motivated by that every day when I'm doing my work, to think about, like, what is driving these poor water quality conditions, or how are, like, climate change and land use changes and habitat degradation affecting our water. And then moving forward, to think about, like, what does that mean for the people who don't have good quality water? So, being in a position to say, this is not acceptable. Like, we cannot live in a world, in Canada, we have 9 million lakes. We have 20% of the world's freshwater supply. We have more water than anywhere else. Yet hundreds of Indigenous communities don't have access to clean water here. So that's important to me. So that's, I think, how I got into water and why I keep working on water. No, not yet. Not yet. Because I think for me, it's important to build those relationships, and I don't, and when that time comes, that Indigenous communities are interested in working with me or hearing what I have to say, then I'd be happy to do so. But I don't want to just go in um, and do that. But I do work with communities in different ways. So I work with citizen scientists, in a lot in the United States, but actually around the world, because I'm aiming to understand how climate change affects ice on lakes. And what I rely on is talking to people who've been collecting data on when their lake freezes or the ice thaws in the spring. And so that involves talking to communities, and so some of our data go back hundreds and hundreds of years, which has been quite nice. And then the other way I work with communities is through my outreach interests and public education interests. So something I developed, I guess now 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, was a science outreach program for refugee families. So, this was a time when a lot of Syrians were coming to Canada, and actually people from everywhere coming from terrible situations coming to Canada, and they would be sponsored by the government. And so I formed a partnership with a refugee reception center. And what we did was we took the families on science trips every other month across the city to welcome them to Toronto, but also to introduce them to some science and give them a community of people that they could reach out to. So that's my community work, which isn't exactly, I think, what you might have been asking about of that. So actually, I started working on ice when I started my postdoc at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And one of the questions you asked, who is one of your big influences on your professional life? And that would be John Magnuson, who's, I think next month he's turning 89 years old. He's a retired professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he did all of the seminal research on climate change and how it affects fish communities and lakes. And he started with ice. So he was working on lake ice, and he put together a workshop and invited people to Wisconsin and to ask them to bring their large data sets. And he did this in 1995, I think, and I'm actually doing the same thing next week. So we're kind of he's really inspirational. And what his way of doing science was collaborating with people. So just being very open, sharing data, making all the long-term data available, but then also supporting the younger researchers and giving them a voice. So when I went to Wisconsin, he actually, he saw me sitting at the desk, and he knew me because he was my external examiner at my PhD for my PhD defense. But he said, Sapna, I want to show you something. I know you're working on fish, and I know you're working on these climate change. I want to show you something. So he's like, oh, look at this long-term data set I have of this ice record of this lake in Madison. And I was really interested in statistics, like I mentioned. And he's like, maybe you can try some statistics on this ice data. And I said, okay, I'll try stuff out. I'll see what I can do. And I learned some things. And then he said, okay, so here's some more data that I have. So he started with one lake, and then slowly he was like, okay, here's this other thing that I have. And he just took an interest in me, and he took an interest in my analytical skills, but then also took the time to teach me about climate change and teach me about so I was really good at the analysis, but I wrote like a statistician. And then he taught me how to tell a good story. So how do you take your statistics, and then how do you make it into something that someone will care about? And he was really influential in that, and my work to just make it more relevant to people outside in my field, but also outside my field. But Also, like the importance of talking to media and to communities and to educate the general public about climate change. And so I've talked to him a lot about like how do you reach people? And so for him, the way he reached people was through storytelling and um and local stories. And I also actually like telling stories. And so I've used that storytelling approach from him as well. And not so much but what's happening in my backyard, but one of the data sets he shared with me was this data set that goes back to 1443, and it was collected by Shinto priests from Japan. And they like measured the date, and they're still doing this. 15 generations of priests have been like recording the date that the lake freezes from 1443. And so then we can start understanding how climate changed before and after the Industrial Revolution. And back when I started working on climate change and talking to the media, there was a lot more climate change denial and skeptics and people who wanted to silence your voice, who didn't want you to talk about climate change, and who, but like I kept doing it. And this record with the priests was really instrumental in changing my media conversation about climate change, because suddenly it was priests keeping data, and the likelihood of them lying about it for 700 years was really low. And so it was helpful to help change like the public discourse on climate change and answer some of the questions that some of the skeptics had with some of our data. And that's why I love working with ICE, because like it's some of the longest records collected by people, but it's also something everybody looks at. Like when you live in a northern country, you see a frozen lake, you see a frozen river. We play hockey here, we go ice skating or ice fishing, and it's just part of the culture. And so, studying that has actually, I study the effects of climate change on a variety of things, but lake ice, I feel like, is so special because people can see it and can relate to it, and it helps them understand how the world might be changing. So that's my connection with lake ice. Yeah, so in their religion, they believed that when the lake froze and this ridge formed on the ice, that it was a sign from their god. And their legend was that a god and goddess lived together on the shores of Lake Sua. This is the lake. And after some time, they got into a disagreement, and the goddess moved out, and she built herself a shrine on the other side of the lake. And there's actually like a whole bunch of stories around feminism and independence, female independence from this legend as well. But every winter, when the lake froze, the god would cross the frozen lake with his dragon and leave his footsteps behind. And that was in the ice ridge that was formed. And he went to visit the goddess and ask for forgiveness. And so for the Shinto priests, it's a very important religious tradition, and it's an important sign from their god. And they've measured this frozen lake for hundreds of years. And, at the beginning of their records, a lake froze every single year. Every year it froze. And this Amawatari, that's the ridge, was formed. And now, in the last 30 years, it freezes maybe every 2 to 3 years per decade. So something that happened every single year is becoming a very rare phenomena. And but the priest still goes every day. He goes to check the lake for ice until February 5th, and every morning he'll go. And it did freeze this year, and they're still waiting for the ice to be thick enough for the Amawatari to form. And if it does, then they'll have a ceremony on the ice, like they've done for 700 years. So to me, that's a very beautiful story of just being so connected to your environment. And but then they also shared that information with us, which I thought was incredible. To share it with scientists from a whole different hemisphere, from a whole, different place. Um, and the priests sometimes asks us through translations to send us our latest findings, because he's really interested in learning about what we were learning from the link. Yeah, so we're looking at, we just started this project looking at ice in the Arctic, like through lake ice, sea ice, and snow. And what we want to do is try to figure out, how is ice changing and how does it affect transportation? Because Arctic communities, remote Arctic communities, indigenous communities rely on ice roads in the winter to get access to food, fuel, medicine, supplies, and to connect them to other communities. And the ice is getting thinner. And so we're wondering what that might do to the ice roads. We know from other work that the ice road seasons can get shorter in warmer winters, but what will it do to the safety? And then if the snow changes, how is that going to affect trails, where, you need to access snowmobile routes to get to traditional hunting grounds? And then with the sea ice declining, that's actually increasing marine shipping. So we're wondering how, like with increased marine shipping, will these communities end up getting more food and supplies through those routes instead of ice roads? So that's something that I'm working on for the next 2 years. That's a good question. So one thing that I feel like I do that's pretty sustainable is I don't drive. I either walk, take transit, the bus, the subway, the streetcar, to get around, as much as I can. Like sometimes you need to get in a car, but I feel like that's been a big change. We also moved from a big house in the suburbs to a smaller house with a smaller footprint into the city, where we could use public transit more easily. And I feel like that's something that I do. I'm mostly vegetarian, but not entirely vegetarian. And but that is a choice to try to eat more sustainably as well. And I guess those are the two big things. I think the way I'm doing it is I'm a professor, so I have the ability to work with many students, and they're pretty amazing. And the university that I work at, York University, it's in the northern part of Toronto, and I think 60% of the student body are people of color, students of color. And so it's a very, very diverse. And many of the students come from first generation families. They're the first to go to university. Many of our students come from immigrant families. So growing up kind of in a lot of them similarly to how I did. And, being a professor at an institution like that is pretty amazing, because, part of it is just being there. You can be a role model to students who have not seen a younger female professor in the sciences of color, and the women do come to me, but also the young men. So my classes, interestingly, uh, I think we were talking about earlier that ecology in Canada, there was a panel called "Why is Ecology So White?" Because it's quite a white um, job or field. But in my classes, there's so much diversity. And in my lab, we have so much diversity. There's just students from every background who didn't know that they were interested in the environment, or were, but didn't think it was a possible career, um, or just wanting to be in a class with someone who looks like them. That's one way to pay it forward. And then the other way to pay it forward is when you become um, in a leadership position, to advocate for more marginalized communities and the marginalized students, um, and mentor them. But I feel like the advocacy is a big thing, and I do that a lot. So like, when you're on search committees, to make sure that the rest of the committee members see the applicants and the CVs of our non-white colleagues in the same way that they see other applicants, without, because of, there's unconscious bias um, that many people see. And then also like advocating for a student. So one thing that I did was I recognized that the scholarships that they were giving undergraduate students in my faculty were way below minimum wage. And students who come from, financially disadvantaged backgrounds, they can't volunteer in the summer. They need to work because they support their families, they need to support themselves. And so they can't volunteer for a research position, or they can't accept a job that's like way, way, way below minimum wage. So like that was something really important to me, to make sure that undergraduate students are paid fairly, and so that everyone can apply, and not just students who come from more privileged backgrounds. And so I think advocacy is a big thing. Another thing that I did last year, I was co-leading this huge Gordon Research Conference. Maybe I shouldn't say the name, but this huge conference, and it was very prestigious. And we planned a very diverse conference, and because of COVID, 80% of our women couldn't attend. And we had worked really hard to have like a gender balanced program, had people of color. So the people who couldn't come were the people of color and the women. And this conference still wanted us to move forward with this meeting. We'd spent 2.5 years planning it. We raised so much money, and we said, no, we're not having an all white male meeting, because it was the first one. And so if you start the first meeting with just a small subset of the world's population, then those are the people who are going to keep going, and the women and the people of color would have a much harder time joining that community later on. So I felt like that was a big deal, like, sticking up to something that was prestigious and an important organization, and saying, no, we're going to build something that's inclusive, and that's what we did. And I feel like good about that. So I try to do that in whenever I, like, you have to make decisions all the time. And so just thinking about like, what is the decision that will help or support a marginalized community member, or how can I change what the subjective is, or what the barriers are, and try to remove some of those barriers so that somebody who wouldn't be able to attend could, or be a part of it. So that's sort of the things that I try to do. we trained like 600 refugees. We introduced them to science, and we introduced them to many times, like the first time that they heard about conservation or evolution. And then some of them wanted to go on and get an education, and tried to support them through their applications, and um, where to sign up for English classes. And I felt like that was, I feel very proud of that, because we did it with no very, very, very little financial support, and entirely like just on volunteers at the university. Many of our volunteers were people were refugees. They came to Canada as refugees, or they're immigrants, and just wanting to pay it forward. So I thought I am proud of that organization that I was able to create. I think the advice is to believe in yourself, and um believe in yourself, and be willing to adapt. So sometimes things don't work out in the way that you expect, or sometimes you think that something is going to be a certain way, and it's not, or you had a dream, and it's okay to adapt. And just, if you believe in yourself and you act with strong ethics, and you act, I think that ethics are a really important thing to, that's very important thing to me. Like if I feel very strongly about my values and trying to do what the right thing is. So even if I'm in a situation where um I don't agree with what everyone else is saying, I feel like now I have the confidence to just say what I believe. And I guess, as to my younger self, I would have said, do that sooner. Like, you don't, if I tried to do that in some certain circumstances, but sometimes you're with people who you think are more powerful or influential, and you feel like maybe you shouldn't say something, but if it aligns with your values and making the world a better place and supporting marginalized communities, then you just should say it. And it might make people uncomfortable. It usually does. Or they're like, okay, they might not have considered it, but they respect you at the end, because even if they don't agree with you or didn't think the way you do, they respect you for being true to your values.